Okay, right. This is from a paper I wrote recently on Metacybernetics. It's a term I took from Forster, von Forster, and it took quite a bit of ingenuity to set it up. I wasn't sure when I started it where I was going, but eventually I came to an end. I think for those of you who are interested in this, probably the paper is best to read, but this is a takeaway from it. So what I'll do is I'll first take you through very quickly some fundamentals of complexity and of agency theory. Then I'll come to a slide which identifies the propositions, the new propositions I've created, and then I'll give some examples. You'll find, for those of you who have got these slides, there are 9 slides, but I'm only presenting 7 as per requirement. The other 2 are elaborations of some of the examples. So, now why isn't this going? Can you? How strange. There we are. Some basics. So instead of reading through every single line, I think most of you are aware of what complex situations are and what wicked situations are. So complex situations, unpredictable, ill-structured, dynamic and evolutionary, and so forth. They become wicked when the tangles that are created within the relationships and the interactions are more difficult to identify, and when any resolutions, attempted resolutions at least, to problems that involve wicked problems, end up with more problems that then have to be approached in order to try and resolve them. On the right-hand side, you'll see some agency theory. This is really, there are plenty of agency theories around, but this is my agency theory, which is a general theory, involves autonomous interactive agencies, a broad range of phenomena, that's why it's called a general theory, involve levels of analysis and configurations, because as I explain in my recent book that's coming out, should be coming out next month, one can develop theory by introducing configurations, and then you have to show how those configurations relate and connect in order to develop theory. 2 particular aspects of general theory are that they have substructure and superstructure. And for those of you who've come across either building theory or engineering or Marxian economics, you know that substructure and superstructures are something that are talked about a lot. Substructure is something that underlies structure. Superstructure is that which is supported by a substructure. A substructure is supported by a substructure. So substructure has causal agents that produce an effect or are responsible for events. And superstructure have propositions that can be testable and enable theory building. So I can't see what the title is, but I think this is agency. Agencies are complex autonomous living systems, have maintain unclear and dynamic boundaries and other features. But agencies are living systems that have internalizations. Internalization allows assimilation, what Dubois calls weak weak anticipation, and it has accommodation, and Dubois calls that strong anticipation because it's system-based rather than just simply model-based. In other words, the model becomes integrated into the system, and then the system operates as though that model is part of it. Agencies are viable systems. So we have Beer's viable system hierarchy, which of course comes from Simon's notion of systems hierarchy, where viable systems are autonomous entities with autonomous entities within them, so that every viable system has within it and is contained within a viable system. A generic model of a viable system applied recursively within a viable system is a recursive fractal. And in a sufficiently complex agency, behavior is regulated by a higher order or meta, if you will, system that where the regulations that reside within it emerge from a tangle of between agent interactions. That's not something I invented. It's something that comes out of evolutionary economics and other fields. Propositions of Metacybernetics. You have stability and uncertainty reduction. So stability involves is substructural and can be explored through horizontal recursion. The ideate, that being the model that is now integrated into the system, should sufficiently reflect agency relations with its externality. So Piaget originally was talking about how children learn, and he explained how they learn through a recursive process of observing and then integrating what he observes. And it continues until he knows sufficiently well, the child knows sufficiently well what it's seeing, what an object is. Von Forster used that, and he developed his notions of stability, and other people followed him. And from that, he developed the notion of the eigenvector and eigenbehavior. Under complexity, knowing higher order relationships can enable improved stability of assessment. That's a proposition I'm suggesting. For instance, how is a regulator regulated itself? A multi-ontological set of recursive regulators is substructural, occurs through horizontal recursion, and this delivers a metasystem hierarchy, something I've introduced, which is really related to a system hierarchy, but it relates to the metasystem. A metasystem hierarchy is defined through axiomatic generic causal agents, which, if they exist, provide broad and definitive explanations for adaptive process, and they can improve an assessment of stability. So that was the first component. The second component is uncertainty reduction, and that is all about superstructure, and that involves system recursion, where hidden superstructural relationships can be uncovered. So Beer did that in what I call vertical recursion, when he was trying to find looking at different foci in order to dig up hidden data information to try and illuminate what was happening in an organization, and that's in VSM. And then there's metasystem recursion. Again, it's substructural, is concerned with regulatory structures, and it also involves vertical recursion. So let's move on. Here we have one representation of Beer's VSM. Now in this, he has the metasystem, he has the system, and there is also S2 coordination. Beer didn't really discuss where coordination went, and it was neither part of the metasystem nor part of the system. It was just in some space that isn't defined. So on the right-hand side, you see some descriptions of this and the nature of the linkages. These linkages are communication linkages and information flow linkages. So we can move on to a modification of that by translating that into a third order. If I move back again, I'm sorry. Sorry, let's go back here. This is basically a second order cybernetic system. And if we want to try and find out a bit more about it, or perhaps try and work out what coordination is and where it goes, we really need something like a third order cybernetic system. And here I've introduced the metasystem, for want of a better name. We've got the metasystem, which is really strategic, involves coordination and integration. We have the system, and the metasystem is connected with policy. Policy and futures are connected together. Now, this starts to get complicated because the connectors that we have here are not just information flow and communication channels. They're actually networks of processes consistent with autopoiesis. And they actually enable this, this three-dimensional system to work in a slightly different way from that which Stafford Beer was discussing. Also, one has to, when you want to read the data on the right-hand side, you'll find the relationship between coordination and integration and control is slightly different. Coordination has to be elaborated on, and actually it contains what I've called the ideate. So it's a slightly different model from Beer's, and necessarily it has to be because you're changing the cybernetic nature of what's happening. So if we wanted to possibly be adventurous and say, well, what is happening? Well, sorry, I'll go on down a moment. Oops. Here we have policy and futures. If we're interested in what policy is and how policy comes about, or what futures and development planning is and how it comes about, we really need a way of exploring that. And one way of doing that, and I'm not saying it's a good way, but one way of doing that might be, if we can validate it, is to construct a fourth order system. So here we have a metasystem. Here we have a metasystem, which is really, so policy and integration coordination. Metasystem is policy and futures, and you have the metasystem integration and control. And these are 4 dimensions, and you can see it's a 4 dimension because the PIs, which are process intelligence, in the first PI1, that is autopoiesis. PI2 comes from Eric Schwartz, who proposed that autopoiesis on its own isn't valuable because a system doesn't learn, and you need to specify how a system learns. And therefore, he introduced the concept of autopoiesis or self-creation. And if you want to then create another dimension, I've done this, but I'm not promoting it as a valid construct. You could create a PI3 autogeneticus, for instance, which means self-origin, which determines how policies and future are actually created through knowledge, meaning, values, and principles. There's a major problem with this sort of modeling. What does it actually mean? And it all depends on how you define policy and futures, and there are issues. So what we could do is we could reduce it back down to a 3-dimensional by changing the nature of this connection. So I've done that in the slide that I'm not showing you because I'm keeping to 7 slides. But that is basically a proposition that one could consider as being valid or not valid. It's immaterial, but all that it does is to demonstrate the possibilities if you've got higher orders. And there's a consequence to higher orders and second order cybernetics, in that one can develop methodologies that can be very useful in exploring complexity. So in the book that comes out next month, I demonstrate a methodology that actually enables one to evaluate personality. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about individual personalities or organizational personalities, the same mechanisms apply. And you can actually develop, I've actually developed a technique whereby one can evaluate the organization and then try and work out where its pathologies are and where it's failing. For instance, is it an organization that has psychological problems or not? So that deals with horizontal recursion. And finally, I can go to vertical metasystem recursion. And here we have the psychological model. And I'm finishing off with this. In this model, we have a third order cybernetic model, which is the system, the cognitive system as a normative personality, and that is for the organization. And we have the cultural environment. And the cultural environment actually affects the way in which the cognitive system or normative personality of the organization operates. But if it's all very well to talk about the normative personality of the organization, but what does it consist of? Well, one can use vertical metasystem recursion by developing a model, which is a fractal of the overall approach that drops down. And here we have a model of personality, metasystem, personality metasystem, and personality operative system. And these are connected by processes intelligence. And these, so we've got, in Piaget's terms, autopoiesis is really operative intelligence. And autogenesis, the term that Schwartz used, is also Piaget's figurative intelligence. So these work in order to develop the personality and enable the personality to respond to situations. So I think that's it. I think I've managed to do it within my time period. Is that right?
Yes, 18 minutes. Thank you so much. At this point, please raise the clarification questions.
Yes, I would like to, if possible.
Yes, why not? Go ahead.
Why not? Yeah, my problem with reading this, let me first give my congratulations with your book.
Oh, thank you.
Let me first say that. My problem with reading this is that, how do I test that? How do I know that the one picture is better than the other? How does empirical material come in?
Well, for start, if we go to the modification of, if we go to this slide, you don't. You've got to try and find a means by which you can test it. I have done that for a three-dimensional, a third order cybernetic system in the book, in which I investigate Donald Trump's personality, and I also investigate Theresa May's personality, and I come out with conclusions which are pretty much the same as psychoanalysts have demonstrated, but I don't use their material. I use my own analysis that comes out of the methodology.
But
so
the weakness of psychoanalysis is that it is not so easy testable.
Well, Yes, it is. It is. It's well, easy is not is the word. The methodology is a statistical one because the technique that was adopted uses text and does an analysis of text. But if I didn't want to use that approach, I could put the individual on a couch and go through a whole set of 80 questions, get answers to those questions, do the statistical analysis, and come up with a conclusion. So
you did this with Donald Trump?
Yeah, I didn't do the 80 questions with Trump. What we did, we had 10. I wish. I didn't think he could sit on a couch long enough. What we did, we had 10 readers. One was a journalist. There were a few students and various other people. I didn't run it. A colleague of mine ran it. And we went through his book and various other lengthy tracts of material and did various analysis on that data to come up with some conclusions that indicated which of the characteristics for the traits. Let me go back down here. You see each of these figurative orientation trait, operative trait, cognitive trait, they're all traits. And these traits actually have meaning. They, in the book that comes out next month, we show in great detail how one derives the characteristics that determine the traits and how we can make measurements of those traits. And then we apply that to both Theresa May and Donald Trump and come to conclusions. Does that help?
Maurice, I have not have a chance to read your long book. Two quick questions. One is about stability. You mentioned so one of the important components of your framework. So are there any practical methods to measure stability at each local system or part of the what you call agent? That's question one. Question two is about this layers, meta. Do you see time horizon and the time dimension of how these different layers emerge, or is just purely in the perception that it's a way you see it? It's like a filter or like a lens. You see the system, or is it actually in Piaget's sense? It's these systems developed one layer after another, so more and more, and eventually linked to the outer skirt of a cultural environment.
Yeah.
So
let me answer the second question that I still remember, and you can remind me of the first. In principle, I'm talking about in principle, you can go to an nth order, but in practice, you don't. You're lucky to get past a third order. And the reason is because I'll call them intelligence, process intelligence. Piaget took operative intelligence and figurative intelligence. And there's plenty of evidence that introducing these two types of higher orders of cybernetics enables you to do things that lower orders don't allow you to do. To go to a fourth order, in other words, you've got 3 process intelligence, that is a tricky one. You've got to convince people that it's valid, and that's a paradigm, isn't it? And you've got to demonstrate that it is valid. Even with if I forget about Piaget and I just concentrate on Eric Schwartz, his work is not well known. So that ought to autogenesis actually exists is still debatable, because there isn't a sufficiently large enough core of people that will say, yes, it exists. But because of my mapping of autopoiesis and autogenesis to Piaget's work, we do have some evidence that, in fact, it should exist, and that it does create a new paradigm. To propose that we can have higher and higher and higher orders is in theory valid, but then we're bound by practice, we're bound by pragmatics, we're bound by relevance and validity. And in general, I would be very loath to see a fourth order cybernetic system without a lot of evidence that it actually exists. Does that answer that question?
Yeah, sort of. We'll follow up on that later. The first question is about how do you measure stability?
Well, you know, the simplest way, if I have an idea about what the real world looks like, you know, stability, I have to say that stability, measuring stability has to be a function of critical realism. If you're a constructivist, then you can't do it because all the world is constructed. So your question only becomes valid if you accept critical realism. Now, in that case, what you do, you have a model in your head, and then before acting on it, you might wish to check it out. So you might do something and see if what you're doing gives you what is expected in the real world. And if it doesn't, then there's something wrong with your understanding of what is reality. And that's a pragmatic approach. Theoretical approaches, I don't know, because I'm relying on von Forster and others. There were two others whose name I've forgotten now, but it's in the paper, who explored stability, but they were exploring it from a theoretical perspective, not a pragmatic perspective, not trying to find out an iterative process. But I'm certain that it would be feasible to create some mathematical mechanism where you can define an object in terms of certain characteristics and then use an iterative process. And that's exactly what we have in simulation, where you start off with some idea and you think you know where you're going, and then you create your mathematical structures, and then you iterate and see if the final iteration you come to at convergence, if you're lucky, results in what you think it should result in. So that's a suggestion. It's not.
Could I make a suggestion, Jason, just quickly about stability?
Yes.
Yeah, so very quickly, just looking at it, to me, it's self-evident. You're using the word normative, which means repeating a norm, routines. So if you're looking at someone's personality, you're looking at how frequently they repeat a trait, and that in itself is a circularity. And we could pull in Lerman here and his expectancy structures. So someone who is repeating something is in a circularity, which is self-evident that it is some form of stability.
Okay. I'm more concerned about the extent, because some people are more stubborn than others. And so some people are more flexible and easy to change, and some people are very determined. So the process, and that comes into the viability of the system. So Piaget's equilibration, of assimilation and accommodation, shows that there needs to be a balance. If you change too quickly, you don't achieve stability and you lose control, or you adapt too quickly. So it's a balance.
So you could ask, every system has to mutate slightly to be able to cope with random changes coming in. If it mutates too fast, it loses its identity. If it mutates, so the answer is in the viable systems model already, I would argue.
Good, thank you.
More questions?